The harbor was quiet, but the silence felt alive. The moon floated over black water, and shadows moved beneath the surface like ghosts. 6 men, each carrying death in silence, swam slowly toward the heart of enemy power. No engines, no planes, no warships, only human breath, steady strokes and explosives hidden against their bodies. They were about to do the unthinkable, strike a blow so deep inside enemy lines that the Japanese would believe the ocean itself had turned against them. Manila had fallen to the Japanese months earlier, and with it the harbor became a jewel of their empire. The city, once alive with trade and light, now groaned under the heavy boots of occupation. Soldiers lined the streets. Watchtowers stood like hungry wolves around the docks. Every ship that entered carried supplies, fuel, and weapons that kept Japan's war machine alive across the Pacific. To the Japanese, Manila Harbor was safe, shielded by guns, patrol boats, and the fear of their empire's reach. But across the ocean, America had not forgotten. The fall of the Philippines had been a wound, a deep scar etched into the pride of a nation. For sailors and soldiers forced to surrender, the memory of Manila burned like fire in their hearts. Commanders in secret rooms studied maps and whispered about payback. Planes could not easily reach the harbor. Heavy ships could not slip past defenses. The Japanese held the skies and the waters. Yet in the shadows of war, a new kind of weapon was being prepared. Not machines of steel, but men of flesh and will. The plan was born in whispers. A small group of underwater fighters, later called frogmen, would be trained for the impossible. They had no armor, no shields. Their bodies were the vessel, their lungs the engine, their courage the only guarantee. The idea was madness. Swim into a fortress harbor, slip beneath the noses of guards and searchlights, and attach explosives directly onto Japanese ships. No heavy guns would thunder. No aircraft would scream overhead. The harbor would be destroyed from beneath by hands and hearts in the water. Training was brutal. The men learned to move silently in the ocean, to hold their breath longer than seemed human, to fight the currents, and to ignore the cold that cut into their skin. They practiced placing charges on steel hulls in darkness, their fingers numb but steady. Every exercise pushed them to the edge of breaking, yet none broke. Each man knew the risk. Capture would mean torture or death, but each carried the same fire inside. Manila had been lost, but not forever. By night, they prepared their weapons, small explosive charges fitted with timers. Unlike bombs dropped from planes, these would be placed by hand. They had to be set close, tight against the enemy's ships, where the blast could tear steel and flood compartments. Precision mattered more than force. A single, well-placed charge could sink a destroyer. The mission was chosen for a moonlit night, when shadows were deep but not absent. Too much darkness, and the men would lose their way. Too much light, and the enemy would see the ripples of their movement. The balance of survival rested on the sky above them and the water around them. As the night came, the 6 men stood at the edge of their boat. They stripped down to the bare gear needed, nothing extra, nothing noisy. Explosives were strapped to their bodies, wrapped tight to stop them from floating. Their hearts pounded, not from fear alone, but from the weight of history pressing on them. If they failed, the enemy would mock their weakness. If they succeeded, the Japanese would never again feel safe, even in their strongest harbors. One by one, they slid into the water. The sea swallowed them, cold and endless. Their boat drifted back into darkness, leaving them alone in the vast harbor mouth. Every sound mattered now, the splash of a wave, the faint hum of a patrol boat engine, the distant clang of chains on steel decks. They moved low, almost flat against the surface, letting the night hide them. Each stroke pushed them closer to danger. Inside Manila Harbor, life continued as always. Japanese sailors joked on the decks of supply ships. Guards patrolled lazily, confident that the Empire's power kept them safe. The city lights behind the docks glowed faintly, as if mocking the silence of the approaching intruders. None of the soldiers on shore could imagine that 6 men were swimming under their noses, carrying enough fire to shatter the night. The frogmen kept their eyes fixed on the hulking shadows of ships. They could smell the faint mix of oil and salt in the water. They could feel the vibration of engines through the sea itself. Their bodies were stretched thin, nerves alive, but their training held them steady. They were ghosts now, slipping into the harbor's heart. As they reached the first line of anchored ships, the reality of the mission pressed heavier. Searchlights swept across the water. Any ripple could betray them. A single shout from a guard could mean bullets raining down. Yet the harbor was big, and the Japanese had grown used to silence. The men moved like shadows no one expected. Each man carried his share of explosives. Each had his targets. Communication was impossible in the water. They had rehearsed every step, every motion, so that silence became their language. The plan was carved into them, unshakable even in the face of fear. The harbor seemed endless, rows upon rows of Japanese ships resting in false security. To the frogmen, each ship was a symbol of power, of loss, of the lives already taken. And now each ship would also be a target. Their mission was not just destruction. It was a message. America could strike anywhere, at any time, with men who needed nothing but courage and the sea. And still, the night grew quieter. The men pressed forward, closer to their first targets, closer to the moment where silence would turn into thunder. The first ship loomed above them like a mountain of steel. Its hull was black, massive and dripping with shadows. The frogmen slowed, their hands brushing the cold metal as if touching a sleeping beast. One wrong move, one clank of gear, and alarms would echo across the harbor. But the men were steady. They pressed their explosives against the hull, tightening the straps, setting the timers with fingers that had trained for this moment in endless drills. No words, no sounds, just the quiet click of death being prepared. Each charge carried the weight of lives lost months earlier when the Philippines had fallen. Each one was a silent promise that surrender would not be the last word. The men knew they had to vanish as quickly as they came, but in those minutes time slowed. The water seemed thicker, the air tighter. Fear lived in every heartbeat. One diver looked up. Above him, only feet away, a Japanese sailor leaned over the rail of the ship, tossing scraps of food into the water. The man froze. If the sailor glanced down, if his eyes caught the faint glimmer of bubbles, the entire mission would end. Seconds dragged like hours. But luck held. The sailor turned away, his voice lost in a laugh, as he walked back across the deck. The diver exhaled slowly and slipped deeper into the shadows. One ship down. Many more to go. The frogmen moved carefully, spreading out toward their next targets. Patrol boats still circled the harbor, but none expected enemies below the surface. It was as if the Japanese believed the ocean itself belonged to them. That arrogance was the frogmen's shield. At the second target, the water grew shallower. Anchors rattled against chains. The men could hear the muffled sound of engines cooling. This ship was a supply vessel, heavy with crates of ammunition and food. Sinking it would mean starving soldiers at the front. Once again, the charges were set, quiet hands against cold steel. The mission had no room for mistakes. Each man's survival depended not only on his own silence, but on the discipline of the others. If even one panicked, if even one lost control, the harbor would erupt in chaos. But these men were bound by something deeper than fear, trust. They trusted each other with their lives, with the mission, with the fire that burned behind their silence. A patrol boat engine roared closer. Its searchlight cut across the water, white beams slashing the night. The frogmen pressed flat against the hull, hearts hammering. The light passed, sweeping wide, and for a moment it lingered on the ripples near the ship. A breath held, a heartbeat skipped, but the beam drifted away, and the engine noise faded. The harbor returned to silence. The men rose from the shadow, their work unfinished, their courage unbroken. By now, 3 ships carried the seeds of destruction. The frogmen swam deeper into the harbor, where the largest vessels waited. Here lay destroyers, sharp and menacing, their guns pointed outward, as if daring the world to challenge them. These ships were Japan's pride, guardians of the empire's reach. To touch them was to strike directly at the heart of Japanese power. The men moved slower, more carefully than before. Guards walked the decks above. Voices echoed down into the water. Chains groaned as the tide shifted. The divers worked like surgeons, attaching charges to places where explosions would tear the belly of the ship open. Every motion was rehearsed, but every second stretched nerves to the breaking point. One diver surfaced for a moment to check his bearings. The city of Manila stretched beyond the harbor, dim lights glowing faintly through the mist. He thought of the people still trapped there, civilians living under the weight of occupation, their freedoms stolen. For them, he pressed the charge tighter, setting the timer with precision. Now came the hardest part. The men had to retreat without raising suspicion, without leaving any trace of their presence. The explosives would detonate in minutes, but if discovered before then, the Japanese could stop them, or worse, capture the frogmen alive. The swimmers regrouped in silence. They gave no signals, only shared glances in the dim light of the harbor. Their mission was almost complete. 7 ships targeted, 7 explosions waiting to be born. They turned toward the darker edges of the harbor, their bodies gliding through water heavy with oil and salt. The city slept on, unaware that the night would soon be torn apart. Japanese officers prepared for another day, secure in their victory, believing their empire was untouchable. Sailors snored in hammocks, confident that Manila was theirs. They could not imagine that 6 men, armed only with courage and explosives, had just rewritten the balance of the harbor. Minutes ticked away. The frogmen swam harder now, lungs burning, muscles aching, but the thought of what was coming pushed them forward. They did not need to look back. They knew what was about to happen, and then it began. The first explosion ripped through the harbor like thunder tearing the night apart. Steel split. Flames shot high into the air. A Japanese supply ship tilted violently, its deck cracking, sailors screaming in confusion. The sound echoed across the city, shaking windows, rattling doors. Before the shock faded, a second blast roared, tearing open another vessel. The harbor that had been quiet minutes ago now erupted in chaos. Sailors ran across decks, shouting orders. Searchlights swept wildly, stabbing the darkness in all directions. Sirens wailed, and machine guns fired blindly into the water, hitting nothing but waves. But the frogmen were already gone, swallowed by the sea. The third explosion followed, then the fourth. Each blast was a hammer, striking the Empire's pride. Flames rolled across the water, black smoke rising into the night. Ships groaned as they sank, dragging men and supplies down with them. Panic spread across the harbor. Nobody knew where the attack was coming from. No planes circled above. No submarines lurked at the mouth of the bay. The Japanese shouted in disbelief, convinced the harbor itself had betrayed them. By the time the 7th ship was struck, the harbor was an inferno. Water boiled with wreckage, oil slicks burned across the surface, and sailors screamed into the smoke. Officers barked commands, but none could explain what had happened. To them, it seemed impossible. An invisible hand had struck their fleet from within their strongest harbor. Far away, the 6 frogmen surfaced in the open sea, lungs heaving, hearts pounding. Behind them, the horizon glowed red. They could hear the distant echoes of fire and panic. They had survived. They had done the impossible. And in that moment, the balance of war shifted. The harbor was still burning when the frogmen vanished into the night sea. Behind them, chaos reigned. Flames painted the water red and orange. Ships tilted, sinking into black waves. Alarms screamed across the city, and Japanese officers shouted into radios, demanding answers no one could give. Who had attacked them? From where? Their ships had been sunk inside their strongest harbor, and not a single enemy was seen. To the Japanese, it felt like a betrayal from the ocean itself. For the frogmen, escape was now a battle against time. The explosions had lit the harbor, and patrol boats roared into the water like hunting dogs. Searchlights swept wide, tearing across the waves. Machine guns sprayed the surface in blind fury. Every splash of water drew fire. The 6 men pressed themselves low, swimming slowly, letting the darkness hide them. Their only hope was silence and patience. One diver felt the vibration of engines close by, the heavy churn of a boat passing over him. He stayed motionless, lungs screaming for air as bullets tore the surface above. Oil from the burning ship spread into the water, stinging his eyes and choking his throat. Still he did not move. Seconds stretched like eternity, but the boat passed, the lights drifting away. He rose carefully, taking one breath before sinking back into the shadows. Every man knew they were still in danger. They had destroyed the ships, but they were not safe until they reached the open sea. The Japanese were searching with fury, convinced that submarines or torpedoes had caused the disaster. None imagined that 6 men with explosives had done it. That ignorance was the frogmen's only shield. Hours passed as they swam, muscles cramped. Salt water filled their mouths. Fear pressed against their chests, as heavy as the weight of the sea itself. But they carried the fire of victory in their hearts. Behind them, Manila harbor still burned. Each stroke away from it was proof that they had done the impossible. As dawn broke, the men reached their hidden pickup point beyond the harbor's mouth. Their small boat, disguised as a harmless fishing craft, waited in the distance. Exhausted, the frogmen pulled themselves aboard, collapsing on the wooden deck. Their bodies shook with fatigue, but their eyes carried the sharp glint of triumph. They had struck at the heart of the empire and lived to tell it. When they returned to base, the reports stunned American commanders. 7 ships destroyed in a single night. No heavy bombers. No fleet carriers. Just 6 men and silence. The mission became a legend whispered among soldiers. It showed that the enemy was not invincible. It proved that courage could bend steel and sink ships as surely as bombs from the sky. But the true impact was yet to come. Across Manila, Japanese officers scrambled to explain the disaster. Investigations filled the harbor with suspicion. Guards were accused of sleeping. Sailors were interrogated for sabotage. Commanders argued, pointing fingers at one another. How could 7 ships sink without warning? Some believed the Americans had developed invisible weapons. Others swore spies inside the city had betrayed them. None guessed the truth, that a handful of men had swum into their harbor and planted destruction by hand. Panic rippled through the ranks. If such a strike could happen in Manila, then nowhere was safe. Every harbor, every supply depot, every anchored ship suddenly felt vulnerable. Patrols doubled. Barbed wire spread across docks. Spotlights burned all night. Soldiers fired at shadows in the water. Fear had become their new commander. The Japanese Navy, once proud and arrogant, found itself shaken. Manila was supposed to be untouchable, guarded by walls of steel and guns. Yet in one night, 6 men had made them question everything. Their doctrine had always rested on power, on the belief that only massive fleets and heavy weapons decided battles. Now they realized that silent, unseen threats could cripple them just as surely. In Tokyo, reports from Manila spread through military councils. Admirals argued over the meaning of the attack. Some claimed it was luck, an accident never to be repeated. Others saw a deeper danger. If the Americans had men capable of striking in silence, then Japan's empire, stretched across countless islands and harbors, was suddenly fragile, and the fear grew larger than the truth. The Americans had only a small number of frogmen, still learning, still untested, but the Japanese imagined armies of them. Rumors spread like fire through their ranks. Whispers told of invisible swimmers able to sink ships anywhere, anytime. Sailors lay awake at night, staring at the black water beside their vessels, convinced that death moved just beneath the surface. For the frogmen, the mission was more than a single victory. It became a symbol. It showed that America could fight back with creativity, not just strength. It proved that even in the darkest days, when the enemy seemed unstoppable, surprise and courage could tilt the balance. The men were honored quietly, their names kept in secret, their work hidden in classified files. But to those who knew, they were heroes who had turned the tide of fear. Still, the war was not over. Manila burned for days, but the Japanese empire remained vast. Battles raged across the Pacific, from island jungles to open seas. The frogmen's mission was a spark, but the fire of total victory still lay ahead. Yet even as fleets clashed and planes filled the skies, the memory of Manila haunted the Japanese. They could not forget the night when silence became thunder, when shadows in the water brought destruction greater than bombs. The frogmen returned to training, their bodies scarred but their spirit unbroken. New missions awaited. Each one carried the same risk: capture, torture, death, but none hesitated. They had seen what 6 men could do in one night. They had felt the fear ripple through the enemy, and they knew this was only the beginning. Back in Manila, survivors of the harbor attack stood in silence as wreckage was cleared. Charred hulls jutted from the water like broken teeth. The smell of fuel and death lingered for weeks. Japanese commanders swore it would never happen again. Yet in their eyes, behind the anger, lay something deeper: doubt. For the first time, they knew their empire was vulnerable, and that doubt, more than the flames, was the true victory of the frogmen. The smoke over Manila harbor did not fade quickly. Days later, the water was still black with oil, and twisted wrecks jutted from the surface like broken bones. Japanese soldiers worked with cranes and ropes, trying to raise what remained of their ships. Sailors whispered in fear, their voices trembling as they pointed at the water. They no longer trusted the sea. Every ripple looked like danger. Every shadow below the surface felt like death waiting to rise again. The empire that once claimed mastery over the Pacific now lived with doubt planted in its heart. The frogmen's strike had gone far beyond sinking ships. It had shattered confidence. Japanese commanders had believed their harbors were fortresses safe from enemy hands. But the explosions had proven them wrong. 6 men had broken the illusion of invincibility. 6 men had forced a mighty empire to admit it could bleed. In Tokyo, the reports spread like wildfire. Admirals sat in silence as the numbers were read. 7 ships gone in one night. Questions cut through the war councils like knives. How had this happened? Was there a spy? A traitor? Some argued that Americans must have built secret bases nearby, hidden submarines capable of slipping past defenses. Others insisted there must be an entire division of underwater saboteurs. None could accept the truth that only 6 men had carried out the attack with nothing but explosives and courage. Fear reshaped strategy. Defensive patrols doubled around every harbor. Soldiers were ordered to keep rifles pointed at the water at all times. Nets were stretched across entrances, blocking anything that might swim through. Searchlights burned into the night, sweeping endlessly across waves. Ammunition was wasted on fish, dolphins, and shadows mistaken for enemies. The Japanese were fighting ghosts of their own imagination. Meanwhile, the frogmen themselves returned to quiet shadows. Their mission was never broadcast. Newspapers did not carry their names. Families back home never knew what dangers they had faced. The secrecy was deliberate. America wanted the Japanese to remain confused, to keep fearing what they could not see. Silence was their greatest weapon, and mystery was its shield. But among those who knew, the men were legends. Commanders studied their mission as proof that war could be fought in new ways. Courage and creativity could strike harder than fleets. The frogmen trained others, passing down their knowledge, building a force that would be used again and again across the Pacific. For the Japanese, the lesson was bitter. Their doctrine had always been about size. Bigger ships, stronger fleets, overwhelming numbers. Manila showed them that numbers meant nothing if even a handful of men could slip past their defenses. It was not just a loss of ships. It was a loss of belief. Soldiers who once bragged of empire now looked nervously at the water around their anchors. Officers who once barked orders now muttered in quiet tones, wondering if the next night would bring more unseen saboteurs. And then came the cruel twist. For all their fear, the Japanese never realized the true scale of the threat. They imagined hundreds of frogmen, whole armies of silent swimmers waiting to strike across the Pacific. In reality, America had only a few dozen, still learning, still improvising. The attack on Manila had been daring, almost reckless. It succeeded because the 6 men believed in something stronger than fear. But the Japanese did not know that. Their fear painted the Americans as superhuman, able to sink ships at will. That fear forced Japan to stretch its resources thin. Extra guards at every harbor, endless patrols, wasted ammunition. All of it drained time and strength from their war effort. The frogmen's true victory was not just the ships they sank. It was the enemy doctrine they cracked open, the empire they forced to question itself. Years later, survivors of Manila Harbor would still speak of that night. Some described the explosions as if the sea itself had turned traitor. Others swore they saw shadows moving in the water, only to vanish as quickly as they appeared. For many Japanese sailors, the fear of underwater saboteurs never left them. Even in different battles, even far from Manila, they still watched the waves, convinced something unseen was stalking them. The frogmen had become more than men. They were myth, a phantom that haunted every harbor and every fleet. When the war finally turned, when Japan began to lose island after island, some looked back to Manila as the first crack in the empire's shield. Not the biggest battle, not the bloodiest, but one of the most humiliating. A night when 6 men, silent and unseen, showed the world that Japan was not invincible. For the frogmen themselves, the memory never faded. They remembered the cold water, the burning lungs, the brush of steel hulls against their fingers. They remembered the fear of searchlights and bullets in the water. They remembered the thunder of explosions behind them as they swam into darkness. And they remembered the pride of knowing they had done the impossible. In the end, history would almost forget their names. Manila Harbor would be overshadowed by greater battles, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. But in the quiet corners of memory, in the whispers of those who study the war's hidden moments, the night of the saboteurs remains. A reminder that wars are not always decided by fleets or bombs. Sometimes 6 shadows in the water can change everything, and perhaps that was the greatest fear of all. Not the loss of ships, not the flames, but the realization that even the strongest empire could be undone by silence, by courage, by men who came like ghosts and left nothing but wreckage behind.